We've all been there. There have been countless times game devs have delayed a game because they're working hard on it and trying to release the best game ever. However, when the game does release, it ends up being a big disappointment and you're questioning why the devs even delayed the game. In this video, we look at 15 games that were delayed but still managed to get it wrong. Stay tuned. Star Fox Zero. It hasn't been easy for fans of the Star Fox series. After skipping the Wii console and its huge audience, Nintendo opted to revive their dormant spacefaring anthropomorphic heroes for the Wii U in order to use the console's new gamepad technology. Nintendo were coy about the title's place in the Star Fox timeline, and despite a name that implied it as a prequel, it essentially acts as a retelling of Star Fox 64, which itself was a retelling of the original game. Due to land in November 2015, 2 months ahead of the launch, Miyamoto himself released a statement announcing a delay to February 2016 to tighten up the game's controls. These controls wound up being a point of contention with everyone who played the finished product, described at best as awkward and at worst utterly confounding. More criticism was leveled against the concept of having to use both the television and gamepad screens at once, and new vehicle additions detracted from the core gameplay. For a time, it seemed that Star Fox Zero could prompt a revival of the franchise, but save for a crossover with the Ubisoft Starlink, Fox McCloud and company have been quiet ever since the game was released. Gran Turismo 5. Gran Turismo 5 may just have one of the most low-key, bizarre development histories of all time. At the 2005 Sony E3 conference, Polyphony Digital revealed Gran Turismo 5 as Vision Gran Turismo by playing an altered version of GT4 with new cars and new maps. However, the game was delayed and didn't release until 2010. Whilst it was overall favorably received, it didn't really make the leaps and bounds some were looking for. For example, Gran Turismo 5 did include 1,000 cars, but only 200 of those were given the premium rendering service and the others were simply upscaled from the PS2. Package in awkward interface controls and long load times, and the 5-year wait seemed unnecessary. Wheelman. Up next, we have a game from Tygon Studios, a game development company founded by Vincent Diesel. The Wheelman was a bit of a passion project for Diesel and was set to be the video game tie-in for a motion picture. Whilst the film has spent the last 15 years unfinished and in the void, the video game did eventually release after 3 years of development. Several delays saw it move from 2007 to February 2009 and then slip again when publisher Midway filed for bankruptcy. Diesel's attempt at perhaps taking a shot at the success of Grand Theft Auto and Driver was met with a resounding shrug of the shoulders. It wasn't a tragedy, just resoundingly uninteresting on every level. Awkward controls, bad enemy AI, an empty open world that is incredibly boring to explore on foot, and graphics that just weren't up to snuff considering its dev time. We can't be too harsh on Tygon Studios though, because they gave us the Riddick games at the very least, so it's not all bad. Galleon Islands of Mystery. Following the success of Tomb Raider, designer Toby Gard went on to pursue a pirate-shaped dream, announcing Galleon in Edge magazine in 1997. Gard believed so hard in the project that he wouldn't let it go, dragging it by the scruff of the neck through years of development, different publishers, and different consoles. Galleon started as a PC game, then jumped to Dreamcast, to the GameCube, and finally the Xbox. Original publisher Interplay gave up on the project along the way, and Gard had to cut a deal with SCI Games. The 2004 release was met with very little interest, and those who did spend their hard-earned cash on Galleon were rewarded with exactly what you'd expect of a title in development hell for 7 years. Its graphics were outdated, its camera was obtuse, and its controls were dismal. You could feel every bump in the road that the project had been through. Tabula Rasa. Up next we have Tabula Rasa, a game designed by Richard Garriott and was set to be the be-all and end-all of MMOs. That's a strong claim for anyone to make, but when you've got the pedigree Garriott had, most people were interested in what he had to say. Whilst the game was first shown at E3 2005, Tabula Rasa had already been in development for 4 years at this stage, and had, halfway through this time, already been completely restarted. Internal conflict between staff caused the studio Destination Games to fire off 20% of the team and replace them, which meant that 75% of the game's code needed to be rewritten in the process. After 6 years, the title finally appeared and Garriott's name value would not be enough to shift copies or inspire review scores that would beat out the already massive World of Warcraft. Particular sore spots were the game's bad crafting system, plenty of bugs, and a menu that felt like a chore to navigate. 2 years after its release, the servers for Tabula Rasa were closed, and subsequently, the game fell into deserved obscurity. Driver. The original Driver was a PS1 smash hit, celebrated for its challenging driving sim-like gameplay. Driver 2 released less than a year and a half after the original, hoping to capitalize upon the success, but by comparison, the second sequel's development slowed down to a crawl. Release dates bounced from winter 2003 to spring 2004, and then finally July of that year, which meant that players were itching for the next installment by the time Driver 3 was ready. Clearly threatened by the shadow that the Grand Theft Auto series had cast, particularly in its absence, Driver 3 ramped up the out-of-car gameplay from previous iterations and started including more elements that a wider audience of players were familiar with. Unfortunately, it didn't quite have the know-how to back this up. Players were disappointed with a total lack of depth to the gameplay, as well as all manner of bugs and glitches. The way protagonist John Tanner spins and slides around and interacts with the world makes it look like he's on another plane of existence. Driver's attempt to take the series to the next generation of consoles had nothing to show for its 4 years of development, Final Fantasy XV. Few other games in the Final Fantasy series had quite a number of sequels and spin-offs, as FF13, and one of those, Final Fantasy Versus 13, never quite saw the light of day. The game was released over 10 years after the initial reveal, which is disappointing in itself. However, when the game did release, fan reaction was polarized, and the delays had caused major cuts to the game. The entire opening was sliced out from the title and released as a prequel film, and thus FF15's early game story was confusing and vague. Overall reaction to the plot was mixed, and some had to question if retooling the Versus identity into its own world was a worthwhile endeavor after all. Furthermore, Versus 13's dark and melodramatic style was missing from Final Fantasy XV, and those who waited for the project with bated breath for a decade still wonder about the lost potential that the original vision seemed so sure to have. Alone in the Dark. Alone in the Dark in many ways created the survival horror genre, but it could never quite make it big in the mainstream. First revealed at E3 in 2006, the game disappeared into the dark for a number of years. Release dates slid perpetually through 2007 and 2008, and even when the game did launch in June, it did so for most systems, with the PS3 having to wait a further 5 months. Alone in the Dark's reboot did try some really cool new things, like allowing players to pick between either first or third-person perspectives, highly interactive environments, and an at-the-time deep weapon upgrade system. It also did some really weird things like giving players the option to skip entire chapters if they were stuck or didn't feel like it. That's handy considering critics panned the game for its high difficulty demands, as well as bad camera, finicky controls, and bevy of glitches. With the game dropping like a stone, what's most memorable about Alone in the Dark's release is Atari threatening gaming publications with legal action for saying bad things about their game. Spore. Spore seemed the next logical step in Will Wright's storied career after producing SimCity and The Sims. It was a bold prospect that followed the transformation of basic organisms as they evolve over time into a spacefaring race. First shown at E3 2005, the game promised viewers a lot. 2 years later, it once again returned to much aplomb with a visual change-up in 2007. As the game got close to release, gamers and publications were theorizing what Spore could mean for the future of the industry. Several delays impacted the trajectory of the project, but gamers could finally play it in September 2008. Spore is a perfect example of believing the hype, and many critics gave it rave reviews despite its issues. Sure, Wright was successful in bringing his concept to fruition, but how it fared as a video game was up for debate. Spore was criticized for having incredibly simple gameplay throughout most of its multiple stages, and whilst the creature creator was applauded, many suggested that it didn't offer the kind of depth that Wright had described. Cyberpunk 2077. This game had to make it to this list, didn't it? Shown at E3 2012 and 2013, futuristic dystopian RPG Cyberpunk seemed as though it was on track for decent success. Fans counted their cash to make sure they were ready for it, and then the project vanished in a puff of smoke. 5 years later, in 2018, the game would finally rematerialize. Due to the 2020 pandemic, Cyberpunk's release was pushed from April to September to November and finally December, with bright yellow calling cards of despair every time. Many became increasingly upset with the situation, whilst others said that it would be worth the wait. Whatever you think of the quality of the game, and congrats to those with the high-end PCs required to enjoy at launch, Cyberpunk had the unfortunate distinction of being the biggest high-profile launch disaster in gaming history. The game's infamously buggy state both ruined the visual aesthetic and made it unplayable, causing it to be pulled from the PlayStation Store, and Xbox owners were offered refunds. Since then, updates to the game have brought it closer and closer to what many wanted the finished product to be. But now and always the legacy of Cyberpunk will be its terrible state at launch, despite its constant delays. Alright guys, that's all for this video. Hope you enjoyed this one. Thanks for watching.